ladies and gentlemen. MrCropper here, joining Mr. 2. This is video number 2 in this series, but this is video number 3 in Mr. 2's channel, because video number 1 was housekeeping. Now, he's talking about power does not corrupt, and he starts off, this is a cliche, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So he's working against a cliche here. He's starting with a cliche, which is fine because it's a very common cliche and it's good to address. Now, I think that this is really, really interesting, really good, and really brilliant the way he starts out here. At 1 minute, from 1 minute to 1 minute and 50 seconds.
Now, the most popular variation on this formulation that I'm aware of is that of Frank Herbert, author of Dune. Herbert wrote, "It is not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. These are false conceptions."
Now, previously he said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He says these are false conceptions. Now, what would the correct conception be? I mean, he's really good like this. I had a disagreement with one of my viewers. I wanted him to state what he meant before he explained it. Then I wanted him to explain it. And then I wanted him to revisit what he was trying to tell me at the end. But start off with your point to tantalize me. Let's see how 2 does that.
Of men's relationship to power. It's not that power is neutral in itself, but poisonous to men, as Acton thought. Or that its call is irresistible to the ears of evil men, as Herbert thought. It's that there is no just way to use power one shouldn't possess.
There we go. We're at 1 minute 38 seconds. There is no just way to use power that you should not possess. Now, really, that's the thesis of his whole video. And if that just rings utterly, utterly true to you, then the rest of the video is just an explanation of it. The thing about putting your thesis at the beginning is, then people have some idea of why they should listen to you through all the explanation. If your thesis sounds interesting to them, they want to know why you would say that, that is your audience. If you give them your thesis and they say, oh, well, I already understand that, and they turn and walk away, that's not your audience. But you've got to give your thesis to start off. All right, that's a slight side point. I just want to point out why one of the reasons Charles II gets so much respect and he's so good, because he starts his videos by saying what he's going to say, then he explains to you why he says that, and at the end he says, now see, I told you so.
The truth is, unwarranted power is corruption. It is impossible to use it properly. It's like having the ability to press any one of 10 buttons and kill any one of 10 corresponding innocent people. There is no non-corrupt way to use that power. No matter how honestly you deliberate, or how scrupulously you avoid bribes, there is no way to answer the question of which innocent person you should kill.
Now, I think there we can see the grain of the meaning. Power corrupts. Makes you corrupt just by having the power. You become corrupt. Like you are, in the sense that you're going to push one of those 10 buttons. There's going to be a victim. So the fact that you have power has corrupted you. Your actions are now corrupt by the nature of having power over people. That's true enough, right?
You shouldn't kill any of them. The only valid answer is to refrain from using the power and to work to wipe it from existence. The crucial takeaway is that the charge of corruption is not the charge you should be leveling at politicians. It's not that politicians get into power and then eschew the public good for their own selfish interests. It's that there is no such thing as the public good, and therefore no valid way to use power aimed at achieving it.
So the politician is given an array of buttons, and each button has a victim behind it, and he's told to choose the public good. And it's just a trap door. It's a rat's game. You can't win. You're going to have a victim, and there is no such thing as the public good to begin with. It's just, who do you victimize? Now, What's the answer to that? Well, whatever you gave to the politician, whether it was housing for the poor or the ability to decide this or that or the other, whatever it is that you gave to the politician would have been decided by individuals, each for themselves. So you're taking away the power of individuals to decide for themselves, and you're deciding for them and then victimizing some of them. And that is the government. Thank you very much. Now you can see why, if giving people economic power corrupts them just by the nature of their action, any action after that is invalid. That is why we've got to reduce the government to the police, the courts, and the military. So they actually just sit there like this until somebody hurts somebody else. That's what. And then how are they? And then they can be corrupt too. The judge could be corrupt. That's true. But the best thing to do is to have these people just sit there until we interfere with each other out in the regular economy. And try to have them not corruptible. What can we do about that?
All that can be done, which is all that is done, is to designate some individual or group as the public, or to create some arbitrary measure of collective utility, and proceed to use power in his, their, or its favor. Power whose purpose is to achieve an invalid end cannot be used for valid ends. Politicians are not corrupt, or at least that's not their main problem. Their problem is that they're being shuffled into this room with buttons and innocent people strapped to execution devices.
Now, my thoughts go to ancient Greece, because they used to put a tyrant in once in a while, and the tyrant had full power for 1 year, like, unusual power. Sometimes defined powers, perhaps, but anyways, the tyrant was put in for a year, and then maybe he would stay for 2 or 3 or 5 years, but maybe he would be out after a year, different situations. And so the tyrant would go in and he would do something like he would take away all the olive presses, and release them out, because someone had cornered the market on olive presses or something like that. Or he would abolish debt for certain class of people who were very heavily put upon or something like that. Now, in the instance of abolishing debt, there was a tyrant who abolished debt, and he was one of the people who was owed debt. He was one of the rich people in town who had borrowed money out, and now a bunch of him and his compatriots had borrowed a bunch of money out, and people were mad. They all owed a bunch of money, and so as a politician he said, you know what, we're just going to wipe these debts off. He said this to the rabble, the masses, the mob. And he himself wiped his own debts off as well, and thereby made the action reasonable for everybody else. Everybody thought, well, of course he's going to keep his debts valid. He's going to keep trying to collect his debts, but he's going to make the other guys wipe their debt. No, he did his as well. So power, and so in that instance, the guy had power, and virtually anything he did was going to hurt somebody, right? The only way for him to legitimize that is for him to hurt himself too. So that's an instance where there's nothing right. There's nothing right that you can do when you're given the situation of power. What should have happened, of course, was each individual should have worked out for themselves what their debts were according to law. And if there's something on the law that if your debts get so high that you can't pay them, then there has to be some sort of median where you meet the person who borrowed you the money. And the person who's borrowing the money out has to know that law too, and has to know that if they borrow $100,000 to some guy and the guy goes and spends it, and there's no way of paying it back, you suing the guy isn't going to do much because he doesn't have anything. So people borrowing money out learn to be careful about this. All right, so power corrupts by the nature of the fact that it shouldn't exist to begin with. What should exist is 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 individuals working these problems out for themselves. What ends up existing is some politician working the situation out, and where there might have been a lot of trouble if the individuals worked them out for themselves. It's not necessarily happy for every single individual. There might have been lots of bad things on various levels all over the place, but when you give it to a politician, you guarantee that there are going to be people damaged. Guarantee it. And it's not even going to be the individual's fault or up to the individual's virtues or hard work or anything like that. The individual now is taken out of the equation, and it's up to the arbitrary actions of a politician what happens to whatever, their fortunes, their business, whatever it is. So there we are.
And they're being told to deliberate fairly upon who should be killed. If it seems strange that corruption is so unavoidable in politics, it is strange. You have to recognize that you're telling these people to make choices, any of which they'll be blamed for. This becomes obvious when you stop to think about the contradictory requirements people place on politicians. The same requirements are seen as both good and bad, depending on how they're framed. People say politicians should compromise and be responsible to the people. Yet when politicians make that calculus, they're accused of being lapdogs for special interest.
Now you wonder why politicians are so cynical. Well, because they're told, don't compromise, stick to what you told us when we elected you. And once they get in there, we say, well, you got to, get together with the people from the other side, make sure you have enough votes to pass a bill, right? And so they can't win either way. And the politicians become cynical, and they just view it as get in there and then do what they can with the power they have.
Groups, or of being in the pocket of big whatever. What are special interest groups other than large, interested parties of these politicians' constituencies?
All of this, by the way, comes from the line in the Constitution that says, Congress shall have the power to regulate interstate commerce. If we put shall not have the power to regulate commerce, if we change that just a little bit, take off the word interstate and just put shall not have the power to regulate commerce, all this would be gone. All this would be gone, and we'd have such a bigger, freer economy.
Constituencies whose desires these politicians are told they must faithfully reflect. The trouble is that politicians have the power to do things that affect these disparate groups, not that they don't think enough or honestly about who deserves who else's money. When the government has the power to affect all of our lives in such drastic ways, it's not a surprise pressure group warfare erupts.
Now, I would state that a little bit differently. I would say when the government has the power to do these things that affect our lives, every step of instituting that power is an instance of group warfare. Okay? Like when the government decides it's going to build cheap housing, it's automatically in competition with people who are renting housing out to poor people. And it automatically comes into competition with everybody in the town for land, real estate, to put the housing on. So you automatically have victims. You automatically have people you're taking money from to do your project, and your project is limiting other people's options who are affected by that project. So, such as it is.
The reason America was able to accommodate, for the first time in history, different religious groups within a single peaceful society was that it erected a separation between church and state. In the past, governments had the power to crush adherents of those religions that had no followers in power. In the US, since there was no political threat from different religious sects, there was no war. Everyone was free to go his own way without reprisal. For the exact same reason, there should be a separation between state and economics. It's no wonder that there were religious wars when men had the political power to favor particular religions. And it's no...
I just want to mention France right there. Supposedly separated church and state. Supposedly. But they do still fund the educational and cultural aspects of churches. What? Yeah, the educational and cultural aspects. Not the religious part, just the educational and cultural part. Now imagine a mosque where it's getting funding from the government, where the preacher is paid by the government. Imagine this, where the land was approved, leased to it by the government. So it has to be approved by the government. Now, how would you get these things approved? You would have to have people inside the government, right? Well, that's fine. Just set up a council and the government will check and make sure that the money only goes to legitimate mosques and churches. All right, just take over the council. Voila, that's what they did. So now they've got mosques that are on government-approved land teaching stuff that's destroying their country because they only fund the educational and cultural aspects of the mosque, not the religious aspects, because of a separation of church and state. See how weak that is? That's extremely weak, and has led to the downfall of their society virtually today. It's destroying France because they have a separation of church and state except for cultural and educational bits. All right, now how does that apply to us and our economy? It applies directly to our economy. We have a separation of the government from the economy, except where the government needs to regulate commerce. Where does the government need to regulate commerce? Well, it turns out just about everywhere.
Wonder today that there are special interest group wars when men have the political power to favor particular groups. When the power to control a certain aspect of men's lives by force comes into existence, there is no avoiding the war of all against all.
Right. For example, the war of all against all. We have the government telling us through ads and stuff that smoking causes cancer. The government's going around making sure cigarettes have warnings on them and stuff, and the government's trying to tell us this is unhealthy. At the same time, hundreds of millions of dollars is flowing into tobacco farmers to make sure that they are able to produce their crop profitably and they don't go broke and have to shut down their farm, and then we'd have to buy tobacco from somewhere else in the world. But so that we can grow tobacco here in America for the market, we subsidize the farmers. And then we spend money telling people not to use their product. It's insanity.
To control that power. Even honest men fight to control it for reasons of simple self-defense.
See? There are honest people who are saying the government needs to stop people from smoking. The government needs to do something about it. They're honest. They honestly want the government to do a good thing, right? They're mistaken in how they're doing it. They're mistaken in what they're trying to do, but they honestly want to help or improve the world or something like that. On the other side, there are honest people who are farming, and the price of a new tractor is $100,000, and it would take them 10 years to make $100,000, and they've got other machinery, and they've got land, and these other costs too, and it's just like impossible. And so if they get a check from the government every year, depending on how much land they have, whatever the, then that helps them stay in business. And they think, well, it's in the government's interest to have farmers, therefore I'm not being wrong by taking this money that the government's offering me, right? Perfectly rational, reasonable person is not a philosopher, doesn't think in principle. He's just being offered money to make sure his farm keeps running. The government comes and says, we'd like to make sure your farm keeps running. Here's some money, right? So these are reasonable people on both sides. The people who want the government to propaganda us not to use tobacco, and the tobacco farmer who takes the money that his congressman's handing him trying to get votes, right? Farmers, please vote for me. Here's money to help you with your farms. Oh, thank you. It is in the public interest that I keep farming and keep buying machinery and stuff like this and keep the economy going. Thank you. I'll take that and I'll vote for you. See? It's just corruption. Every which way, honest people or not, it's corruption.
Once someone throws you in an arena and tells you to kill or be killed, you have to play the game or die, whether you approve of the blood sport or not.
Interesting metaphor. Let's put that in a mixed economy. Throw a bunch of people in the arena, and one of them comes out on top. Now you can judge that person and say how terrible of him to go around slaughtering and killing his erstwhile compatriots, right? But what choice was he given, right? So like somebody in the free economy who goes around doing fairly naughty things, and then you say, oh, tut-tut, he shouldn't be behaving like that. What choice was he given? He's just put in this economy. He just lives in this economy. He didn't build that.
That's actually one of the themes of A Song of Ice and Fire, which I enjoy on a superficial level, but it's an interesting illustration of that, especially in the first book. I haven't watched the show, so I won't comment on that. Anyway, presumably, though, not all power is bad. Let's organize our thinking here. What is power in the broadest sense of the word? It is simply the ability to do something. If you know how to build a hut, you have the power to be sheltered. If you own a car, you have the power to drive to the supermarket. If you have a watch, you have the power to tell what time it is. If you are a member of the United States Senate, you have the power to vote on legislation. This last is importantly different from the other three. There are two kinds of power: power over reality and power over people. The first is economic power. The second is political power. The point of this distinction is not to say that economic power is good and political power is bad. The point is to identify the nature of each type of power, so we can know what the valid applications of each type are. Let's start with an illustration of economic power.
Now, I don't know exactly how accurate this is, because if a guy has millions of dollars, he has economic power, and does that corrupt him? Okay, so the thing is, whatever he spends his money on, he has to get the willing participation of the person that he buys whatever from or whatever. The problem with the politician is they don't have to get the willing participation. They have the power to write legislation and make a law and just do it. So economic power, he says there's a power over reality and a power over people. And does having millions of dollars give you power over people? So I would say that this is a little bit fuzzy there. I would say there's power. Power means the power to use physical force. That's the essential, right? Because power over people is a fuzzy thing, because if you have millions of dollars, do you have power over people? No. Okay, good. You don't have power over people if you have millions of dollars? No. You have the power to persuade them, right? So what does power over people mean? It means that you have physical force. You can use physical force. That's really what it means. The type of power we're talking about. Because other types of power are kind of weak. Your power to check the time if you have a watch, and your power to persuade people. You have power over people, because if you offer them money, they will be very tempted to do what you are asking them to do. You know, that's kind of a weak definition of power. So power has to mean the ability to use physical force, right?
An owner of a big corporation has tremendous economic power. He can marshal his forces to manipulate matter in amazingly productive ways, and he can offer the results to people in exchange for money. Let's say he invents a new type of extremely durable glass and produces it in his factories. He can offer people his glass in trade, which they may buy, and which may impact their lives in profound ways. But he has no power over them. He has power only over his glass and his factories. He has merely the power to offer, not to compel. He can offer his products or jobs working in his factories, but he can't make people buy his product or enslave his workers. He can only potentially make people's lives better. He can't take anything away from anyone without that person's consent. No matter the scale of his economic power, as long as it is only economic, he has no power to control his potential or actual customers or employees. Political power, on the other hand, is the power to compel, to punish, in the sense that force wouldn't be necessary if someone were willing to go along. So it's the forceful violation of someone's desires and will, and is in that sense a punishment. It's the power the government uses to imprison or to tax. If you murder someone or don't pay your taxes and ignore the authorities, you will be physically forced into prison, or fined, or injured, or killed.
So, power is the ability to use physical force.
Economic power, then, is an unmitigated good if human flourishing is the standard. There is no...
Economic power means the ability to persuade. It means that you've been a big, big benefit to society. So society's given you a bunch of these little tokens that say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You've got millions of these tokens. Now you can turn around and say thank you to them for whatever they do for you. They build you a mansion, they give you a nice limousine, they supply electricity to your mansion every month, they come and take care of the garden around your mansion. They paint beautiful painting to go in your mansion. And so you give them thank you tokens. Millions of thank you tokens that you have, you now spend. The thank you tokens are money. So that's not having power over people, right? I mean, I'm not criticizing Mr. Two here. I'm just saying clarity of language would mean that power over somebody is physical force.
Reason to limit the power of men to manipulate nature to their own advantage. Political power, however, is the use of force to control human beings. Is that ever legitimate? Yes, it is, when it's used in retaliation against people who have themselves tried to control others through force. There we have our principle for how to delimit political power. It should be constrained, such that only so much can be exercised as is necessary to protect individual rights by retaliating against people who initiate force. To repeat, the principle circumscribing political power is, political power should be constrained such that only so much can be exercised as is necessary to protect individual rights by retaliating against people who initiate force. In other words, the government should be able only to fight back. We delegate our right to self-defense to the government. It's a defensive institution. It shouldn't have any power that can be used only offensively. So, the power to imprison is a political power, but an absolutely valid one. The power to redistribute wealth for the public good, however, is political but invalid. The difference is, imprisonment can be used to protect the rights of individuals, in the case of a murderer, for example. But redistribution for the collective good can't be used to protect rights. The redistribution isn't retaliation, it's aggression. The power to tax for Social Security, for instance, is therefore necessarily corrupt. There is no proper way to implement such a tax, because the purpose is invalid. There is no way to decide how much money the government should steal from young people to give to old people. Why?
Now, Frederick Bastiat has something very interesting to say. He says, look to see if the law takes what belongs to one man and gives it to another man to whom it does not belong. This is despoliation, to despoil, right? If the law is taking from those who own and giving to those who did not earn, then somebody is being despoiled, right? Somebody's being robbed. See if the law does that, right? The law should be protecting each individual and what they earn, not violating them.
Why not? This is the crux of the issue. If you understand this, you'll gain a completely new and superior understanding of politics and values. Why can't this be decided? Why is it impossible to figure out how much the government should take from the young to give to the old, or take from the rich to give to the poor, or take from whites to give to blacks? Think about this. Imagine you were given this task. How would you decide this question? What data is relevant? What standards are you going to use to judge who should be sacrificed and to what degree? You'll come up blank, because there is no relevant data. And
let's say you said there is relevant data, but ultimately you're going to decide what data is relevant and what data is not relevant. So ultimately it comes down to whim. It comes down to your decision as the power decider. Well, we're not going to look at that data. We don't care about that. Or no data at all. You just do it according to whim.
There are no reality-based principles to apply. What's left? What's left is what actually happens when these things are legislated. Special interest groups exert as much pressure as possible to get as much as possible, and politicians try to keep as many voters happy as possible by giving just enough to each side so as to leave everyone equally unhappy. In practice, then, no principles are applied. It's pure leveraging of power. But you can see it is this way because there's no other way it could be. When people say that some politician is paid off by big oil or whatever, think about what the alternative is. If he didn't let himself be influenced by donors, then by what? There's no other basis on which to make a decision. Why? Because every value is a value to some individual person. That is the key. There is no God's eye view, no intrinsic value that's valuable to no one in particular. Money is good to an individual for a particular purpose. Since there's no getting out of the context of an individual's particular values, how is one to judge between individuals? Is the judge to choose what he himself wants? That would just be placing his individual values over theirs by force.
See, like I said, it's got to be every single individual's got to decide for themselves. And that may or may not be a pretty picture. Some of those might not be pretty pictures. But it's better than giving the power to some arbitrary individual to decide for hundreds or thousands of people at one time.
Which he also can't justify. What I want you to understand is that that example of the 10 buttons and the innocent people earlier wasn't a metaphor. It was an example of what I'm talking about here. The only answer is not...
It actually was a metaphor.
To choose, not to exert force. To let the individuals involved make their own decisions on the basis of their individual values and individual understandings of reality. There's no way to choose between individuals when force, for their own good, is involved, because there is no perspective that transcends the individual's perspective. No values that transcend the individual's values. There are no group values, and therefore no way to choose by force between individuals for the greater good. Greater to whom? For what? This is why the public good can mean only some individual's good at the expense of some other individual.
Now, in the example of the ancient Greek tyrant who did away with the debts for a few of the rich townsfolk so that the mass of the farmers could be relieved, was that better for society? You know, I don't know. It was basically a mass bankruptcy. Is bankruptcy good for society? Are bankruptcy laws good for society? They certainly are used. Now, if you could find a case where it was better for the society as such, what you would probably find is the action the government took wasn't anything besides ameliorating a slight violation of individual rights. For example, maybe really high tax rates on the poor and high interest rates on loans have allowed the poor to get into this bad situation. Maybe free loans from the government if you're a certain amount of wealthy allows, so people who are wealthy can get a loan from the government, get through their debts, pay it back. But poor people don't have this. They have to buy from one of the landowners around the city. You know, so some violation of individual rights backed everybody into a corner, and now you need a blanket situation, a blanket amelioration of the problem to get out of it. Or, for example, lots of people have ended up without their land because of taxation, for example, and the land is in the hands of a few. And you just pass a law and say everybody gets 1 acre. And that happened in some Athenian city-states. They just passed a law, redistributed the land. And people, instead of working on other people's land now, were farming their own pieces of land again. And it was a way to ameliorate or to fix a built-up destruction of individual rights that had happened over time. Just a direction to think about something, that when there is a valid action like that, it's to put individual rights back in order. It's to reify individual rights when there's a valid action. Not that all actions are valid, but when a tyrant does something right, he's answering a destruction of individual rights of freedom that has happened.
So it's power for these invalid collective ends that must be emphasized as the main evil in politics.
Right. And so I just bring up that side point to say, if somebody brings up an example, it will probably fit that. If somebody says, well, this was a good thing the politicians did, you know, using political power to do this or that. See if it doesn't fit that example, if they're right.
Not corruption. Corruption is still possible. It's not an invalid concept. A judge, for instance, rightly has a certain amount of discretionary power in sentencing. But if he sentences certain individuals more harshly based on racial animus, he's being corrupt. A valid political power doesn't mean an automatically properly applied political power.
Now, wouldn't it be nice if corruption were limited to the police, courts, and military? And we had, right now we're worried about corruption everywhere, in the welfare system, in the local water facility. Look at the Flint water, corruption everywhere in the government. What if we could just whittle that corruption down and let everybody else worry about corruption in their own thing, and the government would only have to worry about corruption in police, courts, and military. So if corruption is going to be a problem, it always is going to be a problem. Limiting the scope of where it's a problem would be better, and let the grocery store owners, like they currently do, worry about corrupt cashiers or something, and let the government get on with the real business. The government shouldn't be worrying about corrupt FDA inspectors and stuff like that. That shouldn't exist. Or maybe the FDA, as a way to protect individual rights, there would be something akin to that, but only to protect individual rights.
Corruption is an evil that must be dealt with, but it is insignificant next to the problem of power that is wholly illegitimate by its nature, which is...
Would you rather deal with a corrupt judge who's sentencing certain people too long or something like that? Or would you like to deal with a corrupt politician who's taking millions of dollars from companies and giving them to some solar power production facility, which is a total scam, and the money just melts and disappears into the wind?
The vast majority of power governments around the world hold today. Corruption will always be around because people have free will, but it doesn't determine the course of civilizations. Rome didn't fall because of corruption. The intentional actions of the legitimate authorities determined that. Just as people you don't like don't determine the course of your life, so criminals don't determine the course of a society. The nature and purpose of the power people want their government to have determines what happens to a society, not the odd abuse of power. Communist regimes don't fall to starvation and slaughter due to corruption. They come to that point because they're honestly trying to achieve communism, the good of the community, conceived as a transcendental super entity apart from the individuals who make it up. This isn't bad news. It means we determine our own destiny. No one can derail us, but that gives us the responsibility to each advocate for the limitations that should exist on political power, to advocate for government limited to its crucial purpose, the protection of individual rights. People have this idea that totalitarianism comes about by a coup or by some sudden corruption of the leader. It's not true. Totalitarianism is the logical end of the faithful application of power for the public good.
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, each instance of the controlled economy, of the government doing something in the economy, every single instance of that is an instance of warfare being cemented in place. The warfare inside the low-end housing economy, the warfare inside the medical industry to approve drugs. Every single instance is just cementing into place a little piece of warfare where conflicting groups now have to fight. So it's not like we build this up slowly and then someday it slips over into warfare. We're building little pieces of civil war. Every single time we build the government into the economy, we're building a little piece of civil war. And we're doing that with the medical stuff right now. We're saying so-and-so has to pay such and such, and they have to let so-and-so on their plan. They have to. And then the people who are selling drugs under this go, well, that's going to double the demand for my drug. I better raise my drug price real quick here. So all of a sudden the price of that drug goes up 3 or 4 times because they could see a huge demand coming down the road, and no reason not to raise your price. There's no reason not to, because you don't know when you're going to get hit over the head, and you're going to be the victim next week. Right now, that guy's the victim, so get his money quick, because somebody's coming to hit you over the head next. So it's instituting little teeny pieces of civil war. Every single bit of the controlled economy is a cemented piece of civil war.
The public is determined to be the economic class or the race.
All right, well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. I guess that was the end. We've got a minute and a half left. Should we see what else goes on?
If you have questions about this episode's subject or anything else, just send them to Charles. You can also leave a review on iTunes wherever you have more than 1 to 2% of a podcast's listen.
All right, no, it was all just a commercial. Well, if you appreciate what I do, please go to Patreon and support me. If you like this series, then let me know.